Absolute pacifism is the most uncompromising and ethically demanding form of pacifist thought. At its core, absolute pacifism holds that all violence is morally forbidden without exception. This position does not allow for justified war, defensive killing, capital punishment, or coercive force, even when such violence is undertaken with good intentions or in response to grave injustice. Violence, from this perspective, is not merely a tragic necessity or a regrettable tool. It is a fundamental moral wrong. Unlike conditional or pragmatic pacifism, which may reject war on strategic or consequentialist grounds, absolute pacifism is rooted in moral absolutes. It insists that certain actions, chief among them the intentional infliction of physical harm, are intrinsically evil and cannot be redeemed by circumstance, outcome, or necessity. The ethical question is not whether violence works, but whether it is ever permissible at all. For the absolute pacifist, the answer is unequivocally no. This form of pacifism is most often grounded in religious and theological convictions, particularly within Christian ethics. The moral logic begins not with political realism or social contract theory, but with discipleship. Ethics, in this view, is not about managing the world's violence responsibly. It is about faithful obedience, even when such obedience appears impractical or costly. The foundational figure for absolute pacifism within Christianity is Jesus. Absolute pacifists read the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount, not as unattainable ideals or hyperbolic moral aspirations, but as binding commands. Statements such as, "Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, and put your sword back into its place," are understood as literal ethical directives. When Jesus rejects violent resistance even in the face of injustice and death, absolute pacifists see not weakness but moral clarity. The cross in this reading becomes the ultimate rejection of redemptive violence, the triumph of faithfulness without force. This interpretation deeply shaped the Radical Reformation, particularly through the theology of Menno Simons, the namesake of the Mennonite tradition. For Simons, the true church was defined not by doctrinal correctness alone, but by visible obedience to Christ's teachings. Christians, he argued, were called to live as a distinct moral community, separate from the violent structures of the state. Participation in warfare, holding the sword of government, or using violence for self-defense were all incompatible with genuine Christian discipleship. To follow Christ meant to renounce killing entirely, even at the cost of persecution, imprisonment, or death. Menno Simons and other Anabaptists understood absolute pacifism as an expression of nonconformity. The Christian was not to mirror the logic of the world, which justifies violence through power, fear, and survival, but to embody a countercultural ethic rooted in love, suffering, and trust in God. Martyrdom, rather than armed resistance, became the ultimate witness to truth. In the modern period, absolute pacifism found a powerful philosophical and religious advocate in Leo Tolstoy. Although often remembered primarily as a novelist, Tolstoy was a radical moral thinker whose interpretation of Christianity led him to a sweeping rejection of violence, nationalism, and state authority. For Tolstoy, all institutional violence, war, policing, capital punishment, was fundamentally incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. He argued that states depend on coercion to survive and therefore inevitably corrupt moral life. Tolstoy's absolute pacifism was not passive withdrawal from society, but a form of moral anarchism. He believed that individuals must refuse to participate in systems that require violence, even if that refusal destabilizes existing political orders. Moral integrity, in Tolstoy's view, demanded personal non-cooperation with evil, regardless of the social consequences. His writings would later influence figures such as Gandhi, who adapted Tolstoy's moral absolutism into a strategy of non-violent resistance. What unites Jesus, Menno Simons, and Tolstoy is not a shared political program, but a shared ethical conviction. Violence deforms the soul and undermines moral truth. Absolute pacifism insists that the means used to confront evil must themselves be morally pure. One cannot bring about justice through injustice, nor peace through killing. To do so is to concede the moral logic of violence itself. Critics often challenge absolute pacifism as unrealistic or dangerously naive, particularly in cases of self-defense or genocide. Absolute pacifists do not deny the horror of such situations. Rather, they argue that once violence is permitted under exceptional circumstances, the moral boundary collapses. History, they contend, demonstrates that exceptions quickly become norms and moral restraints erode under pressure. In this way, absolute pacifism functions less as a political strategy and more as a moral witness. It asks not, how do we win, but how do we remain faithful? It shifts ethical evaluation away from outcomes and toward character, obedience, and moral consistency. Whether embraced or rejected, absolute pacifism forces a profound ethical question. Is there any cause, however just, that can justify the deliberate taking of human life? That question lies at the heart of pacifist ethics and sets the stage for all subsequent debates about violence, war, and moral responsibility.